Hello and welcome to How Could We, a podcast by Climate-KIC where we explore the collaboration we need, the lessons we've learned, and the areas where we see the most impact when it comes to climate action. I am your host, Anne-Sophie Garrigou, and today we're speaking from the vibrant floor of Change Now conference at Le Grand Palais in Paris. So this season, we're exploring how European cities are transforming from the ground up, rethinking governance, finance, and urban design to meet the challenges of climate neutrality and climate adaptation. Our guest today is someone who is pushing the boundaries of how we imagine cities and adaptation. Eitan Levy is one of the co-founders of Roofscapes. Roofscapes is a Paris-based urban innovation studio that reclaims underutilized rooftops to create nature-based infrastructure for heat resilience and ecological repair. In a time where more than 70% of Europeans live in urban areas and cities are increasingly exposed to heat waves, floods, and ecosystem collapse, Eitan and his team are asking a powerful question. How could we transform our cities not by expanding outwards, but by regenerating upward? Roofscapes bring together architecture, ecology, community engagement to design green rooftop systems that reduce urban heat, manage stormwater, and create shared public spaces. We'll explore how adapting cities for climate resilience goes hand in hand with creating healthier and more inclusive urban environments. Eitan Levy, welcome to How Could We? Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So, can you start by introducing yourself? How did you end up working on Roofscapes?
So, thank you, Anne-Sophie. I'm a co-founder of Roofscapes. We're a MIT spin-off now based in Paris, where we work on the adaptation of existing roofs and existing buildings to a changing climate and to evolving uses within building. So at Roofscapes, we've developed a system of timber platforms to shade, plant, and make accessible all the roofs that could not be adapted with previously existing techniques. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, all the pitch roofs that are made out of zinc in Paris, that's really our focus. And we're doing this because we want to reduce temperatures, we want to increase water retention, reinforce biodiversity, and eventually have outdoor spaces where urban dwellers can go when they live in very crowded cities like Paris.
Where did the idea originate?
So together with my co-founders, we're architects, and at some point in the middle of our studies, we decided to take a little step back when we became interested in the notion of climate change adaptation and adaptation of existing buildings that no longer have to perform with the same criteria that they always experienced until now. And we worked in several architecture companies, but we felt like the way projects were arriving didn't leave so much room for tactical adaptation at the scale we're operating now, which is a quite precise scale where every building is a bit specific, and we need to have, on the one hand, scalable and replicable solutions, but on the other hand, we need to make sure that these solutions can be adapted to the specificity of each building. So that was around 2018 when we first started thinking about this. In my personal experience, I grew up in Paris under a zinc roof and was, on the one hand, very aware of the potential of the spaces, on how magical it was to be up there on the roof, and on the other hand, very aware of how they tend to overheat in the summer because zinc is a very thermally conductive material. And so 2018, with my two co-founders, Olivier Faber and Tim Cousin, we had a discussion where we started thinking about what could be done on roofs. And then 2020, 2 years later, we were at MIT finishing our studies. Yeah. And that's where we entered the startup incubator called MIT Design X, where we, for the first time, formalized Roofscapes as a company, as a startup. Okay. And now it's been a few years that we're working on this in Paris.
So I was interviewing Marion Valeur from the Pavillon de l'Arsenal a couple of days ago here in Paris, in cities like Paris or Prague, or where the architecture is quite old, and there is a lot of attachment to the cultural, the heritage of the architecture, and there is this idea that maybe those buildings are not adaptable, that those cities are just going to be too warm to be live in. But what you're saying and what Marion was saying from her experience at Le Pavillon de l'Arsenal is that we can actually adapt those bâtiments, their ways, And what I found interesting is that then climate adaptation also isn't just like a technical fix, but also a design opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think you were touching, and Marion was touching a very good point, which is to say, for the past decades, I would say, we have been considering heritage as a very binary thing, I would say. Right? It's either you love it or you will be against it, right? And there are, I think, quite a lot of people who are trying to create this split.
And the split between modernity, modern building, and then the old.
Exactly. And what we're saying now in a lot of projects is that, in fact, you can adapt this heritage, and that, in fact, it's always been adapted. For centuries, people have been adding extra floors on existing buildings, on existing foundations. If you go back to the topic of roofs in Paris, if you read Victor Hugo and you look at depictions of Paris in the early 19th century before the Haussmannian era started, you read about a lot of very, very steep pitch roofs made out of tiles. So things have always been changing, have always been adapting to new conditions. And when you talk to the people who are working, to the craftsmen and craftswomen who are making and renovating those buildings, they're actually talking about how techniques and notions of heritage are evolving. So I think it's super important now to be way more granular than we might have been in the past when we look at heritage, and to stop considering a building as a whole, but to say, okay, there are parts, perhaps the parts that you see the most from the street, the facade, that should not be touched or should only be touched in a certain ways. And then there are parts that are invisible, but that are very harmful to the building. For instance, a zinc roof in Paris is not doing a lot of good for the people who live underneath in the upper floors. And you don't even see it from the street. So that's, for us at Roofscapes, is really an opportunity to start reimagining and repositioning those roofs, and to not only see them as a negative impact on the building, but rather to start mobilizing and leveraging those roofs to do something more positive. And in the case of Roofscapes, with the projects we're doing, we think it's super important to combine the climate and environmental potential together with the social potential, so to make sure that we are creating healthier environment for the people and other non-human living beings in the city, and at the same time to make sure that the people who live underneath are able to have a common space where they can meet and where they can access the outdoors. So yeah, we just think it's so important now to be very granular and to mix up things a little bit.
So can you tell us one more time exactly what it is? What is it that you're doing on the top of those buildings?
We've designed a system of timber platforms. When you have a pitch roof, it's very hard to do anything on it, right? Because you cannot walk on it, you cannot put anything there. So we're deploying timber platforms on top of those roofs. They're raised on pilotis that connect to the structural elements of the building. And once we have deployed these platforms that basically shade the underlying roof and help it cool down, we're able to deploy other things on these platforms. And for us, the most interesting and the most important aspects we can push with those projects is, on the one hand, to have some planted spaces, so soil with vegetation planted in it, and underneath some stormwater retention layers, some water storage, so that whenever there's a lot of rain is being stored somewhere, and then it can irrigate the plants later on when it's drier. So that's one of the things we do. And the other thing is that there are accessible spaces. It's really, really crucial for us that we're not working on climate change adaptation purely as a technical thing, but that we also involve as much as possible the people who live underneath. First, because they're more willing to invest in those projects if they are able to see them and accept them. And also because they're going to do a better maintenance of those projects if they are easily going to walk or use them. So that's what we're essentially doing. And last year, in 2024, we deployed a pilot project together with the city of Paris, with the Direction for Climate and Ecological Transition. And it's a 100 square meter project on top of a building called l'Académie du Climat, which is a former town hall building in Paris. And on this project, we're essentially monitoring the impact on three components: on the temperature reductions, on the water retention and water irrigation autonomy, and on the biodiversity reinforcement. And so we're continuously monitoring those three aspects. But in terms of temperature reductions, what we've already observed last year, which was not a very hot summer, in July, when it was almost 36 degrees Celsius in the air in Paris, the zinc roof, when it was not shaded by our platform, raised almost 68 degrees Celsius on the surface and 47 degrees in the attic underneath. And where we had our system deployed, the zinc roof was roughly at the same temperature than the air. So it was not heating up anymore. It was at 35.7 degrees Celsius. And underneath, the attic was below 30 degrees. So we had 17 degrees less in our shaded attic than in the exposed attic. And for us, that's really the scale of decrease we wanted to show with this pilot.
I'm surprised. I wasn't expecting that much of a difference. And I think that's the thing when we talk about adaptation, is that sometimes we don't realize how much we can actually do. And so the goal now is to scale to other buildings.
Exactly. So now we're working with many public and private building owners in Paris, but also across France and across Europe, to help them adapt their building and their roof to climate change. So we're architects originally, and therefore where we are really focusing is on the design, on the authorization and the permitting, and then on the coordination of those projects. And we work with a bunch of partners to then deploy and build and maintain those projects, because they're living beings in a way, and they need to be taken care of later on. But yeah, that's where we're heading now with the next projects.
What are the main challenges to scale?
Over the years, we've identified perhaps three challenges. One is about financing. On the one hand, financing the projects, but I think more and more people are seeing the value of those projects, both in terms of climate and energy consumption reduction and so on, and as well in terms of uses and the social use you can do with those projects. And that's what we're quite happy with. That's people are now starting to combine these two criteria when they talk about the value of our projects, and therefore it's not too impossible to finance those projects. But then, like many startups, we need to finance our structure because we're starting from scratch and starting with not much, right? So that's always a constant challenge. Then there's been more regulatory challenge at the beginning when we started working on roofscapes. We did it because we felt like roofs, which in a city like Paris cover 38% of the city footprint, we felt like roofs were a bit left out, and especially in cities with pitch roofs, they were completely ignored. Everyone was aware that there was an issue, but we did not see many answers to this issue. So that's why we approached public actors like the city of Paris at the time. Now we're also working with the Région Île-de-France with this urge to adapt and to start working seriously on this issue. So there was a lot of regulatory discussions over the year, the zoning codes with the new Paris resilience strategy. And so that's at the very local level, at the municipal level, I would say. But then in France, whenever you're working with heritage buildings, you're also working at the state level, the national level. And so there was also a lot of discussion. And still, I think we see many people throughout these discussions who are not super open to climate change adaptation when it comes to heritage building, and who I would say are very, very attached. There's, of course, things stay the way they are, but not very much willing in our impression and in our experiences to learn and take on things that work well in terms of climate adaptation from other contexts. For instance, I was earlier this year in the south of Portugal, in Faro, where there are very, very nicely done sun shading devices in the streets to shade the streets, and in Sevilla as well, in the south of Spain. And here in Paris, it seems like it's not accepted yet. It's not something you can do. Of course, it has a visual impact on the built environment and on the heritage, but I don't think it's a negative impact necessarily. I think it can be very easily reversible and so on. But yet, we see so many people who tell us, oh no, those roofs have been like this for 150 years and they should not be changed. They should not look like the ones in Venice that have this same system of platforms on the roof or whatever.
French people are being known for being reluctant to change, right? And we can say that as French people as well.
We can say that as French people. I think it's something we see actually in other contexts as well. I mean, especially in these topics of heritage, which by definition are very local, very cultural, very personal in a way. I think it's not a surprise that there is this reluctance to change, but I think it will need to happen because otherwise we have building that won't be fit for the climate they experience, and therefore people won't live in them anymore, and those buildings will then really turn out bad. I mean, nothing will take care of them anymore. So that's I think the long-term challenge we have with regulation, but thankfully it's going in the right direction. I think people are now catching up and understanding more. And then of course I have always some technical issues where we need to check every building and make sure that it's structurally sound for the kind of interventions we're adding. But for us, it's really one of the first things we did back in the days when we launched Roofscapes, and one of the first things we do now every time we have a project.
Yeah, and you mentioned funding, and we will release a podcast with François Gemène, who was a lead author of the IPCC, and that's one of the things that he's saying in the interview is that there is money for mitigation, but money for adaptation is still very, very scarce, and that's something that is very difficult. But at the same time, when I hear the impact that you can see on like already one pilot project, this should be an easy sell for cities that are going to need to adapt. So a big challenge, the funding. What I found also interesting is that when we talk about adaptation in cities, we often think about project at the ground level. It's the first thing that people think about, planting trees to cool down the streets, etc. And you talk about vertical ecology. What does it mean in the context of like dense urban centers like Paris?
The difference between climate change adaptation and mitigation is that with mitigation, I think it's quite hard to perceive the impact directly, and it's very abstract for many people. Whereas, as we see with our projects at Roofscapes, with adaptation, you see very directly the positive impact it can have. And therefore, I think it's very important that when we look at a territory, at a city, at a region, of course, we're drawn, and especially if we're working with public actors, we're drawn to look at the public space a lot. But when we look at it more granularly, we see, okay, there are as well courtyards and facades and roofs that are not very much leveraged. We are now preparing a project that will be exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale in a few days from now. It's called Climate Realignment, Tactical Adaptation to Urban Heat, and it's basically about showing how at the building scale and with the building envelope we can adapt existing buildings, heritage buildings, to a changing climate, no matter their era. But there's just a few tactical actions we can do on the roof, on the facade, to shade, to vegetalize, and therefore be able to cool down a bit all the surfaces that are exposed to boiling sun, right? And so, of course, if we look at the streets, there's so much potential there, especially for planting trees, because we have actual soil. It's really great, and we should really be doing as much as we can at the street level for water and for planting. But in terms of surfaces, if you look at all the surfaces in a city, you have way more vertical surfaces and roof surfaces, and that's where we think there should also be some work happening. And it's hard for public actors to do it because they mostly control the public space, right? But we're working with a lot of private building owners as well to adapt those private surfaces.
And so you mentioned already that the success of Roofscapes project depends as much on social engagements as on engineering. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about how you work with residents, building owners, local authorities to co-create these adaptive rooftop spaces? And I'm interested in like, is there a sort of like a participatory design, and what does that look like in practice?
Every project at this point is a bit different. I think eventually there might be more streamlined processes, but we're trying out very, very different things for now.
Which makes it interesting.
Exactly. We love it. The first one we did with the City of Paris involved 8 different departments at the City Hall, and we also worked very closely with our roofers and carpenters. And so with all these people, which, in the end I think there were maybe 100 people that were involved in the whole discussions, we came out with some strategies that we would have never come up with if we were alone by ourselves. And so we think that in this notion of climate change adaptation, it's of course super, super important and crucial to involve building users who eventually will be the ones taking care of those projects. It's really important in the design process, but also very crucial, I think, to educate people who might not be aware of the best usage strategies, how they should how they should water something or use a blind or shade something, or when they should access it and when they should not go there. I wouldn't say we have a super formal process in place to do this, but that's one example. Now we're working with a high school building where we are also working with the school community to understand their needs, and the directions versus the students don't have the same needs and the same desires, but it's something we're doing. We're also now part of Interreg Northwest Europe project called Multi-Roof, which is led by the city of Rotterdam and which is about basically combining uses on roofs. So that's we stopped doing only photovoltaic or only green roofs, but that's in fact we start leveraging the potential of our roofs as much as possible, which completely aligns with what Roofscapes want to do. And with this project, there's a big part about citizen involvement, both in terms of financial incentives, but also in terms of site identification. And so I think it's super important to do this sort of participatory design and planning processes. But I also think it's very important to propose some solutions, to experiment, and to have a basis that people can then critique and develop further. Because when we started Roofscapes, a lot of people were like, "Oh, you should not do this with this type of roofs. You should not do anything." And then you go nowhere. So for us, it's really changed a lot to have a first pilot that people can visit, and then they have an opinion. And in general, they like it, but maybe some don't like it. But at least there is something that they can react to, and I think that's super, super important, and perhaps something we don't have enough when we talk about participatory planning or design processes.
So an invitation for people to go to what is called
Académie du Climat.
To l'Académie du Climat to see it in person. What should people do if they want to contact you because they're interested? Who are you interested in being contacted by, and what should they do?
So we have 4 types of building owners we work with: municipalities and public administrations, social housing corporations, real estate companies, and condominium associations. So basically all types of building owners, mainly looking at buildings in dense urban environments because we think that's the most interesting fit for those projects, but of course also open to others. We have a website, roofscapes.studio. And people can reach out to us there, and there's a little form they can fill out, and it's very easy for us then to contact them back.
So we will leave the links in the show notes, and then I ask the same question to everyone for 3 years, which is, what would a beautiful, just, and climate-resilient future look like for you?
So for us, it's a future and a city in which all surfaces are leveraged to their utmost potential, where we don't have surfaces that are mineral and artificial and harmful to the people and non-humans who live there, but instead some surfaces that are planted and used as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Ethan Levy, for joining us on How Could We?
Pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Anne-Sophie.
As cities across Europe move towards climate neutrality, Roofscapes' work reminds us that adaptation must be as beautiful and inclusive as it is functional. This episode is part of our season spotlighting city-led transformation. As you know, Climate-KIC is leading Net Zero Cities program, which is a program under the EU Cities Mission, which aims to support 112 cities to reach climate neutrality by 2030. This episode makes the link between this season on cities and the next season that is coming up in 2 weeks about adaptation. You can find more about Roofscapes and their rooftop interventions in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate us, and share it with someone who is interested in cities transformation. Thank you all for listening to How Could We, and we'll see you next time.